So why designing China now? And I just want to throw out three very general ideas about why China in designing China. Now, the first, of course, and they're almost cliched. I mean, they're somewhat obvious. The first, of course, is at the level of political economy. I mean, everybody's sort of saying how central China now is to the global economy, no longer simply as producer of global goods that everybody else is consuming, though that too, but signals a quite significant shift in the way in which global political economy, and maybe political economy as such, is operating. So it becomes an important site from which to think about questions of political economy, and indeed, of course, the importance of political economy in thinking about the nature of design as well. What do I mean by this? Well, if you think about the history of neoliberalism over the last, certainly in the post-war period, but if you read the little Foucault extract from the lectures, dating even from the 1930s, you can say that neoliberalism has a variety of modalities and various faces, and China looms large, increasingly large, in the expression of neoliberalism's faces. Foucault, you might have noticed, in a very quick sentence, draws attention to, I think, a rather pressing consideration in the shift of what he calls in thinking about what he calls the man of the economic, right? Homo economicus, you might call Homo neoliberalissimus. Where no longer is it simply consumption that is the driving force of neoliberal economy, but it is the condition of, as he puts it, production, and what interests me more than production is the other word he uses, and enterprise. So it's as he puts it, the man, taken generically, of course, the man of enterprise, right, that is considered to be the sort of the subject position, you might say, of the very condition of neoliberalism itself, and not simply consumption. The person of enterprise is one, you might say, capable of, quote unquote, designing their own world, in charge not just of the look, but also of its significance, its meanings, its very values. Right? And so when we think about the way in which political economy has shifted over this period of time, this condition of being enterprising, of being capable of designing the very conditions of one's, or the pretense of designing the very conditions of one's being in the world, right? That enterprise looms so large, and looms so large in the very condition of design itself. And of course, try to have chosen my words carefully here. So political economy becomes the first mode of why China now, and one can elaborate that. As I say, I'm going to be schematic over here. The second is cultural. Right? And again, another perhaps obvious point, the capacity to draw on its heritage and to turn its culture into an industry. So the kind of cultural industry turn of the last, 20 years. To draw on the historical as a source of remake, a notion I'll come back to in due course, of venture, of of possibility itself. Right, so that's the second, the set of cultural conditions and the way in which culture itself has become both an object of enterprise, right, and an object of production and self-production at that interface with political economy. And the third is, again, schematically, the way in which globalization, the operations of globalization itself, globalities have worked increasingly at the interface of the global south and the global north, where the south is in the north and the north is in the south, right? That blending of engagements no longer so easily extractable from each other, particularly in the relation between China and the rest of the world, right? So that those very conceptions and conditions themselves begin to blur, in relation to both the politico-economic and the cultural, and how these things now operate in conversation with each other. So just to take one rather banal example, you might say. So the very figure of Yao Ming. Yao Ming, of course, is a 7'6" basketball player who plays for the Houston Rockets and the Chinese national team in the United States. And maybe this is a peculiarly American kind of example. But if you walk around, he's from Shanghai. He now has just bought the Shanghai basketball team that was falling apart. If you walk around Shanghai, you'll notice Yao Ming's image, looming large over, gyms in his name, fitness centers, and so on and so forth. So Yao Ming, in a sense, becomes, at least for America, if not for others, the symbol of China, its face, its body, you might say. At the Olympics, of course, and now in Shanghai, as I say, the gym, because at 7'6", or however that translates into metric measurements, the giant, at once gentle and dominant, commanding and tenacious, towering and tireless even when hobbled, self-made and self-effacing, is taken or considered or perceived to be the very embodiment of China itself. So that kind of mingling of the politico-economic, to some degree, in the personality, in the cultural personality of a figure like that. One could pick other figures and I think run something like the same set of exemplifications. So moving along then, so that's first. The second is moving along. Why design now in designing China? What makes us suddenly pay attention to design as a large popular interest, you might say even as a kind of mass interest? Why indeed should the humanities and critical theory in particular, I mean obviously the grounds on which we as the organizers stand, why should the humanities critical theory be paying attention to design, to China, to designing China in that set of combination? What sort of humanities, what turn to and turn in critical theory should we, whatever the we is over here, be pulling for, pushing towards? And so I just want to run through, again, a number of schematic considerations to put on the table as we think ourselves through the next couple of weeks and perhaps beyond. So the first is a kind of experimentation, a kind of laboratory. Can we speak of critically designing the humanities, for instance, of de-signing or de-signifying and re-signifying, and if so, how, with what resources, to what ends, of working with, for example, with fragments. Ackbar and I are engaged in a project at Irvine that we're calling, along with some interlocutors we're engaged with out of the Critical Theory Institute, Poor Theory, right? Where poor theory is not a theory of poverty, right? It's a theory about perhaps the poverty of theory itself, right? So how do you conduct theory in the modality of poor theory, in a fragmentary kind of sort of modalities that perhaps we can talk about, sew ourselves into over here. Of working with fragments, of concepts, of theories, of representations, of mixing and remixing, again notions I'll come back to, as methodological dispositions. So what then of relations, of relationalities, as a key methodological component? How do relations or relationalities work as a methodological thread? I don't want to give it any more resonance at this point than that. Of a critical theoretical commitment, of the drawing of and across relations, of the emergence and making of new meanings of the kind we are witnessing from digital domains, for example. We'll hear more about this next week, from what in an earlier sect we call technospheres. Watch here the very impact of design itself in thinking about these things. So this raises the question of mashups and mixing, of the heterogeneous as resources. Levi-Strauss, in one of those little readings in the extract, in talking of bricolage, usefully speaks of a heterogeneous repertoire. Right? So what is the repertoire available to us in terms of a critical theoretic modality? What can we draw on in terms of this repertoire in putting it to work? How does that work differently as a mode of critical theorizing than those we are used to from the canon, for example? What here, of course, of the impact of design? So borrowing from Levi-Strauss, this suggests in the repertoire those assemblages available to a reconstituting critical humanities the following kinds of emphases. For one, on finitude, in the face perhaps of the appeal to the universal. Right? I mean, there's a long-standing debate, obviously, across the history of humanities, dating at least back to Plato, but that has been resurrected in the last few years in debates. You know, you think of Badiou's Platonism in conversation with Balibar's kind of anti-Platonism, right? For instance, you can tell I come from Irvine, right? So on finitude would be one. On contingencies, in the plural, to push the point. Chance intersections as reroutings, the very notion of routings. The possibility of redirections, of openness to possibility itself. So that's a second kind of finitude contingencies. Third would be on the relation of constructions and destructions, as Latour puts it. What is the relation, of course, to deconstruction as, or to the end of deconstruction as a methodological term? How do constructions and destructions work in contrast, say, to deconstruction? On renovation, making, right, again, a term from, in a sense, from design. Making anew as making new, right, in relation to the repertoire, the assemblages of conditions and conventions and conceptions already available to us. So then also on historicity, the historical, just one of the many items from which to draw in this repertoire. To draw together, again, as Latour puts it, pushing the play on its meanings, to draw together. Right? To copy, to remake. Here the historical becomes an inspiration, not an object of preservation. Right? Becomes a possibility, right? Rather than a fixation. So on revision, as a revisioning, right? A looking anew with a view, in a sense, to revise, right? To revision. With tongue only half in cheek is de-signing, and so the signature and de-identification, a mode or potential mode of critical analysis. One's heterogeneity not only takes over, but is recognized as the canvas and palette, the conditions and horizons of our time. Again, all in the plural. So design then, just to play on this a little bit longer and to test your patience a little bit longer. Yeah? Design as a de-signing and re-signing or resigning, right? It is a giving of new meaning, a new signature, even to the historical, as in Ackbar's notorious fakes, for instance. And so creating new signs. Design is deeply tied up with meaning making, with making up worlds, with ways of world making. I think here, for example, of Nelson Goodman's quite famous book from the mid-1980s called Ways of World Making, which may also be ways of word making. Think of the emergent transformations in writing and reading practices in the wake of the technological turn, which make up and also, with make up and also with make believe. And so there's a whole lot more to be said about the notion of make believe and how that plays out as an epistemological disposition in the order of our time, which I won't dwell on here, but I think might be worth coming back to. What is the place of make-believe, right, as epistemological condition both critically, negatively, as a kind of negative dialectic, but also as a set of possibilities in all of this. Re-signing is also resigning, a resignation, a giving in to the remake. At the heart of design is, as I've said, re-signifying, the remaking of meaning. So design, in that sense, remediates. It is, as Latour puts it, remedial. Right, rather than, as he puts it, revolutionary. I mean, there's, again, something to be considered over here that I think is quite deep in the contrast between remediation and the remedial on the one side and what he characterized as the revolutionary on the other. Design then involves, it constitutively depends upon, a disposition to remixing of signs of meanings through in terms of the objects made to bear, but to bear, B-E-A-R, but also to bear, B-A-R-E, to bear, but also to bear them. So at the heart of design is, in a sense, the mashup. It is no wonder that both became coterminously hip, right? I mean, when you think about the historicity of both, not just terms, but also dispositions or practices, right? In a sense, they came together. Became, in a sense, the cultural modalities of a time, if not of our time. Mashups, the throwing together of things together. The throwing of mashups, the throwing of things together, of bricolage, signals the prevailing disposition to remake, to redesign, to rebirth, the condition of being, you might say, born again, of being reborn. Think of the connection to intelligent design. So it's not all good. Eh? It's a kind of the fact that there is an intelligent designer suggests not simply some original, brilliant deity able to make it up or make it all from the blueprint of his or as his preconception. It figures, by contrast, a designer fiddling with possibility. So I'm playing with the designer of the deity. A designer fiddling with possibility, figuring out what might work in experimentation. Is it possible actually to produce the alter figure of the female by removing a male rib? I mean, try it, right? It's a kind of, only trying will tell. The thought itself is pretty crazy. Design is, design is design, right? I mean, there was this kind of plain Latour, and it was interesting. This came out of a conversation. I don't want to say Latour's turn to design is design came out of the conversation. But before we had read, I mean, it's almost cliched now, right? Before we had read Latour, before we came across this little lecture, we were thinking explicitly along these terms. So design is design because design is design. That's what identity logically will do to you. As a constant remaking, design at heart reconstitutes. It remakes the very being of the world, ontologically. Design, in short, you might say, is a philosophy of life, of living, of being in the world. It is a philosophy of life in the most banal of senses we witness all about in the everyday. But it is philosophy of life also in the larger, I hesitate to say deeper as there may be none, sense of drawing on all the available resources that make life, that make survival not just possible, but livable at any moment. At the heart of design, then, is the giving of life, of renewing life, of survival through revival and derivation. The future of design is incapable of escaping history, even as it refuses, and perhaps must refuse, giving into it. That is the paradox, the burden, perhaps the weakness, but also the very strength of design, its manic courage. It's no doubt that mania, underpinning resistance to nomad thought and the insistence to probing anew at the very heart of a properly experimental critical theory, which draws us at this moment, in this place, to the question of design, and to thinking that question in the challenging, if thoroughly mad challenge of designing China. I'm afraid you're all as implicated now as we are. Thank you.
Sorry to do this poor imitation of Lord Byron, but I fell off a fence, so I'll be hobbling around for a few days. Okay, now this is supposed to be a framing session. So one of the ways I think to frame the subject of design is to deframe it, which I think we can do by taking as a starting point the famous statement, the famous sentence by Lautréamont when he says, "As beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table." Now in China today, these surrealist juxtapositions and non sequiturs, in fact, are found everywhere. What was meant by the surrealists to be shocking and surprising is in China today an everyday occurrence. And it's also, we might add, the spatial context for design. To take maybe the largest example that confronts us. What is more surrealist than the socialist market economy, where socialism and market economy encounter each other on the operating table of contemporary China? And when Chinese filmmakers try to give truthful documentation of the situation, the result, of course, tends to be contradictory, as if nothing were true except the contradictions. Now, some ways of evoking this space, and there have been many attempts to, also in different contexts, of evoking these problematic spaces that confront us today, might include, for example, from film theory, a notion, I think, given currency by Gilles Deleuze, of what he calls any space whatever. And any space whatever is simply an ordinary-looking space, like, for example, a preserved building, whose internal grids and coordinates have completely changed. Right? So you look at it, it seems recognizable, but in fact, the way in which you have to understand it, all that has completely changed. Or it could be vice versa, right? An extraordinary looking space whose grids have remained the same. And one striking example of this might be the CCTV building in Beijing, as you know, designed by Ram Koolhaas, a kind of extremely conservative institution, right? Who asked this very innovative architect to design its headquarters, and it looks extremely striking, but in a way, the grids of CCTV as a broadcasting, those grids have remained the same. So, I think either could constitute what you might call any space, whatever. Right? Now, another term from sociology is this term by Zygmunt Bauman's, this notion of liquid modernity, where all rigid systems seem to have liquefied. Things, therefore, no longer possess their own form, but conform to some temporal flows that are only half understood. Right? So that's one sense in which liquid modernity might work. And of course, all this would result in a kind of Salvador Dali-esque picture of the world. And it's as if probably no accident that I think this week or next week in Shanghai, there's going to be a Salvador Dali retrospective, right? So go and see that and see how that ties in with your sense of Shanghai. Maybe just a third, fairly arbitrary example from urban theory is from Koolhaas himself, when he coins his term junk space, what he calls junk space. I'll just give a quick quote where he says, if space junk is the human debris that litters the universe, right, then junk space is the residue mankind leaves on the planet. Right? It's like everything that we're building, let's stop talking about architecture or urban planning. It's all like junk space. It's this residue that is now, that we have left on the planet. Now, these notions and there are many others, right? Which seem to come to roost in China today. Conjure up a space that is counterintuitive, a space that has lost its measure. I think the technical term for this is a non-hodological space. A space that deceives both eye and mind, a space where a kind of disconnect seems to have taken place between the visible and the intelligible, so that you can't easily go from one to the other, whichever direction you move in. So we might say, if we want to be a little bit fanciful or fantastic, that like black holes, this urban space is now a space that cannot be directly observed, but only deduced from the effects that it produces. And these effects are exactly what we are noticing when we talk about architecture, cinema, music, new media, design, and so on and so on. Right? You could think of all these not just as practices, but more along the lines of parapraxis. I mean, these are more like mistakes that are made, the junk space as well, which are the residues of the parapraxis that we see all around us. What is clear from all this, in the midst of all this lack of clarity, is that we cannot talk about design or designing China without taking some account of such a problematic junk space. So the question now then would be, what is design then in this junk space? Now, junk space has the doubleness, shares the kind of doubleness with another similar sounding term, junk bonds. Right? I mean, the reason why I mentioned that is that there would be some people talking about derivatives and junk bonds and so on at a later point. Right? So you might say that junk space has the doubleness of junk bonds, because junk bonds, as you know, are high-risk bonds which also generate high yields. Right? So it's not just high risk. Right? It's not that these bonds are not trustworthy, which they are, but at the same time, exactly because they're high risk, they're also high yield. And this is why I think the upbeat slogan for Shanghai Expo 2010, "Better City, Better Life," has something like an excluded middle to it, right? And namely, the excluded middle here would in fact be the issue of design, right? Or you might even push it further and say the excluded middle would be exactly this question of the risk of design, right? I mean, what you're risking when you're in fact putting forward a design. Now, the most primitive notion of design, which I think we can all agree is inadequate, is to think of design as adding something to an object without essentially changing it. Right? Design basically as packaging. Right? And I think there are still people who think about design in that way, even in a very sophisticated way. But that's one way of thinking about design, as simply as it were adding something to an object without essentially changing it. Now, exactly because I think a lot of other people think this is an inadequate notion, we also find the opposite notion. And the opposite notion is to think of design as transformative, right? As something that is capable of changing culture and society as much as politics and ideology can do. Now, let me just say that this is a truly seductive notion, right? But one that is not without its own risk. One example of this, of course, one famous or notorious example would be Le Corbusier's formula, architecture or revolution, right? These are the choices here, architecture or revolution. And the implication is that design, right? Whether you think of architecture, urban planning, etc., that design can obviate the need for revolution because design already has the capacity to change our lives. Right? That if you do your designing properly, you don't need a revolution. Provided, of course, and this proviso is important, provided, of course, that the expert designer is given a free hand and allowed to act like a kind of benign dictator. Right? The expert has to be able to call the shots, as it were. Now, the problem, though, is that design that, quote-unquote, changes our lives can also be perceived as something that have designs on us, right? I mean, if it changes our lives, it's as if, we are being manipulated. It's like the design has designs on us, especially when it is undertaken by lesser designers, like state city planners. Moreover, it is doubtful whether total design, including Le Corbusier's own, ever worked, right? Even when the designer has not been interfered with. Because of this sort of dilemma, right? I mean, these two opposed notions of design probably won't really work. We may have to turn to a third notion, the suggestion that design itself now is a kind of wicked problem. Right? This is all. A lot of this is sort of passing school stuff, right? It's a kind of wicked problem, and one characteristic of a wicked problem is that you don't even know what the problem is until you know the solution. That's why it's a wicked problem. Now, one everyday example would be, consider when you're writing an essay or a thesis. You don't know what you say, right? Right? I mean, this is a kind of common experience. You don't know what you're saying until you finish it, and then, wow, that's what I was going to say, right? So you don't know the question, you don't know the topic until you know the solution. Right? I mean, that's a really wicked situation. Now, another example might be the so-called hermeneutic circle, which we won't go into. So it's not a matter, therefore, of first defining the problem, right? And then, as it were, and second, working towards a solution. The process, it seems, is much more folded unto itself, right? Much more complicated, right? Made out of pleas, right? Made out of levels and so on, folded into itself. And because of this, as David also insisted, design is therefore always closer to bricolage than to engineering, closer to tinkering than to planning. Now, there may be examples of good or bad design, but there can not be general principles of good design, because these general principles could only be counterproductive. Right? Every sort of set of general principles on what constitutes good design can only be, in the end, counterproductive. Similarly, a history of design cannot be a history of objects that have been designed, right? But rather a history of changing notions of the object, a changing notion of what the object is. So, because of this, and this is my last point, instead of thinking in terms of good design, it may be more important to think in terms of design culture, or what we have called earlier on the spatial context of design, or even better still, to think in terms of what you might call an ecology of design. But you see, in an ecology of design, ecology here cannot simply be ecology that just focuses narrowly on issues of sustainability and the green environment, important though these issues are. Gregory Bateson, as you would remember, who spoke of an ecology of mind, right, also spoke of double binds, which, and of course, a double bind is nothing but a species of a wicked problem. right? And what I would say then is that an ecology of design, which would probably be one of the things that we can think about and discuss, would have to do no less. Would have to be something that would have to address the wicked problems, the double binds, the foldedness, and complexities of this situation. Now, let me now introduce very briefly the third presenter this morning. This is Cheng, who I think every Chinese person in this room would know that Cheng is has been the leading Chinese writer for many years. Right? He's the doyen of Chinese intellectuals. He has a magnificent writing style where this whole sense of language that he has is just inimitable, and which becomes itself a kind of an instrument to probe the world and to probe feelings and so on and so forth. We have had conversations on a number of things, including pipe smoking and fake ceramics, right? Everything except literature. So, but now we have Cheng talking about, I don't know what he's going to talk about, but I'm sure it'll be interesting. So the way it will work is that Cheng would speak in Chinese, because we also want everyone to speak in the language they feel comfortable in. Right? So he'll speak in Chinese, and Emily here would translate, so like every few sentences or whatever, that'll be this translation. Okay, good.
我因为不太能掌握我说话的时间，所以我特别带了一个表，因为应该是15分钟，那我留给那个我的这个翻译伙伴一半。
你可以再讲的长一点，就说因为有翻译嘛，他说其实可以给你多一点的时间，不需要就是只是7分钟啊什么，可以多说一点。
那我刚才说的你还没有说。
我知道，我会I'm a terrible keeper of time, so that's why I take a watch with me onto the stage, so that I can keep track of time. So basically, I have only 15 minutes, so half of it will be my presentation and half of it will be the time for my translator. But this gentleman has kindly asked him to maybe speak for a little bit longer.
我今天想讲的就是我们中国人对自己文化的一个很大的一个错误。
Well, today I'm going to talk about one big mistake the Chinese people make in terms of their culture.
我们知道中国有一个龙，我们中国人特别强调那个龙。
You know, in China, people give high importance to the figure of dragon.
大概在30年前吧，20多年前，有一个歌手，那个台湾的歌手叫侯德健，对，侯德健他有一个他带到大陆来一个很有名的一个流行歌曲叫《龙的传人》。
Well, about 20 to 30 years ago, there was a singer in Taiwan whose name is Ou Deyan, and he wrote a song and brought it to mainland China. The song is called The Descendants of Dragon. Sorry?
The translator.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's on.
It's on.
Do you want me to repeat what I've just said? Okay. About 20 to 30 years ago, there was a singer in Taiwan whose name is Ou Deyan, and he wrote a very famous song, and also the song got quite popular in mainland China. The song is called The Descendants of Dragon.
这个歌在大陆非常非常的受欢迎，这个受欢迎恰恰是一个错误。
The song got very famous and very popular in mainland China, but the popularity of the song, as I see, well, it's a mistake.
它的错误在于这个龙在中国的文化当中是一个工具。
Well, the mistakes lies in that dragon has always been a tool rather than a subject in Chinese culture.
而不是一个主体。
It is a tool, it is not a subject.
所以，我们不可能是一个中国人，不可能是一个工具的传人。
So, the Chinese people can't be the descendants of some tool.
那么我大概介绍一下，它为什么在中国文化当中是一个工具，而不是主体。
Here I say dragon is or has always been a subject, a tool in Chinese culture rather than a subject, and I will give you a few reasons for that.
我们知道，因为在萨满教里面，巫师上天去跟神和中国人的祖先沟通。
Well, in China we have a religion called Saman religion, and the Saman, and the witches, or the figure of the witches, they will talk to the god, and they will perform some duties like that.
那么巫师怎么上去？是有一个工具的，他乘坐这个工具到天上去。 这个工具有很多，但是后来他们被集合成一个符号，就是龙。
So the witches or the wizards of this religion, they will ride a kind of tool to get to high into the sky and talk to the gods. And what is this thing that they ride? It is dragon.
因此，中国的这个龙和全世界的龙。 和类似的这样的图腾符号吧，它是一致的，都是工具。
So the Chinese dragon is just like the other dragons or other totems in the world. It is a kind of tool.
那么，如果把它误会为主体的时候，中国的龙和世界的龙就不一样了。
So if you mistake the Chinese dragon as a kind of subject rather than a tool, then Chinese dragon will be different from other dragons, other totems of the world.
如果世界的龙这个工具是保护性的，因为保护呢，所以它很凶恶。比如说，它会阻挡王子去见那个公主。
Well, the dragons from other parts of the world, they are quite protective of what they have. So basically, they will defend what they have. For example, they will try to do something, try all means to prevent the prince, to save the princess.
那中国的文化核心就是凶恶的。
the dragons of the other parts of the world, they are usually very mean and very powerful, so and very wicked. So the major culture of China, I say, is a little bit wicked and powerful.
所以这个就是工具和主体一个错误置换造成的。
And that is why I say the dragon has always been a subject in the Chinese culture, tool in the Chinese culture rather than a subject.
我相信，如果大家有机会参加明年的世博会的话，这个图案，这个龙的图案仍然会大量出现的。
Well, if you have a chance, you might visit the World Expo in Shanghai next year, and I'm sure you will bump into a lot of dragons or the dragon pictures or symbols.
我希望大家明白，那个是一个工具。
Well, I hope you can understand that dragons in China is a tool rather than a subject.
而不是主体，而不是中国文化的这个主体。
It has never been and is not the subject of Chinese culture.
那么，我以前因为也说过这个意思。那么有中国人问我，他说：“那中国皇帝前面这一个方块上面画了一条龙，那不是表示我是龙吗？这个皇帝跟大家说我是龙吗？”
Well, some people have asked me some question before, like the emperors in ancient China, they wear their gowns, and in front of their gown there's a symbol of a very big dragon. And some people ask me, does this mean that the emperor he sees himself as a dragon?
我们知道中国的一个皇帝，他是由古代的远古的祭师，后来呢，世俗化变成有世俗间最有权力的人，也就是国王。
Well, the emperor of China, well, in fact, in the very, very ancient time, they were the wizards or the most powerful people in one community. And later on, because of their high power, the concept of emperor or the king emerged. So the emperor is seen as the most powerful people in one kingdom.
所以他是可以上天和祖先做联系的人。
So people say the emperor, they can go high into the sky and talk to their ancient people and talk to the god.
所以他胸前的这条龙，这个龙的这个图案，是一个工具的等级表示，一个等级。
So I say the dragon on the gown of the emperor is actually a kind of a symbol signifying what kind of carrier the emperor can use to go anywhere. So it is a symbol of hierarchy. It's a symbol of levels.
类似跟你们说，我乘坐的是 Rolls-Royce。
Well, it's something like the emperor saying to you, what I ride is Rolls-Royce, instead of any other car, any other sedan.
Bentley.
Or Bentley.
但是不是 Volkswagen。
So it's not a Volkswagen or any other similar cars.
仅此而已，是个等级的一个工具的等级的这个概念。
That's it. It signifies a kind of carrier, kind of traffic tool that the emperor used. It's a symbol of hierarchy rather than anything else.
那么，也就是说，我不是我胸前的这条龙，我胸前的这条龙只是我上下沟通的工具。
So the emperor is really saying, well, I am not the dragon that is on my gown. The dragon itself is a carrier or a kind of media that I can talk to the god or to anything high in the sky.
所以，《龙的传人》这首歌把整个中国人搞乱掉了。
So you can see the song called "The Descendants of the Dragon" has really made the Chinese culture a little bit chaotic because people got very much confused after listening to this song. They mix up the tool and the subject.
这里面引起的问题跟设计有关系。
And I say this is a question that is related to design.
就是我们中国人把自己的一个本来很容易说明白的一个主体性，把它设计成工具。
Well, in fact, the Chinese people have used kind of very clear subject and design it into a tool.
就引起了非常大的，我认为是一个危机。我认为是危机，就是因为它反映了一个大致从1840年以后中国对于自己的认识。
Well, this kind of mixing up has really created some crisis, and because of its negative impact upon Chinese people's self-reflection or self-recognition after the year 1840.
从那个时候，中国人开始认为工具非常重要，包括引进的工具非常非常重要。
After the year 1840, the Chinese people have come to realize the importance of tools and also the imported tools from other countries.
以至于到今天，终于把 工具作为主体了。
And today they are now treating the tool itself as a subject.
我想讲的大概就是这些。
Well, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Can I ask one quick question of clarification? I mean, there's a sentence that I don't understand, and I think some of it. What did you say? It's a
Truth.
It's a true, not a subject matter. What's that word?
Tool.
A tool.
It's a tool. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a tool. Right. Okay. It's a tool. I got it. Right.
Okay.
So it's a tool, right?
他自己的问题就是说，一开始他也没有理解这个工具和主体，他可能工具这个词没有听清楚。现在下面跟他解释了，说这是一个工具，不是一个主体。
我可以回去了吗？
Can he?
行。